I guess all of us have had the opportunity to introduce ourselves. Uh, so I'll proceed and highlight two key objectives for this event. First, we want to start a conversation. It's a conversation about livestock farming and climate change. It's a conversation about what we eat. It's a conversation about global food systems. We have invited all of you here because we do understand the key role that you play when it comes to global food systems. We believe you form a critical component of people who are better placed to speak authoritatively when it comes to how we produce our food. So it's our first meeting. I understand some of you have attended several of our events, which is culminating to this one, and having this in mind that COP27 will be held here in Africa, in Egypt, in November. So we thought it's good to have this conversation with you. I understand there are quite a number of conversations that have happened talking about COP27 here in Kenya and in other African countries and also globally. But again, from a food systems point of view, I think this forms a good basis for us to initiate that conversation and see how we engage during this COP27 and beyond COP27. The second key objective in this summit, we'd like to come up with a common ask. We'd like to come up with a joint statement just to show we have met, and being the people who are better placed to speak about global food systems. This is what we want, how we prefer things to be run out. This is how we prefer global systems to be considered. So at some point, there'll be group discussions just to talk how this joint statement will look like. And with that, I also understand media is here. We appreciate your presence here because it's very critical at this moment when we are having these discussions. Those will be our two key objectives, but again, I understand after group discussions, maybe you might be able to create other objectives to feed into that. And with that, I will request Mr. Tennyson Williams, Country Director for World Animal Protection Africa Office, just to come here and to invite you officially, and again to speak to you so that if it's your new time interacting with us, you understand who World Animal Protection are. Thank you and welcome, Tennyson.
Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, friends. Good morning. Good morning. I hope you are all doing well. My name is Tennyson Williams. I'm the Director for the Africa Office for World Animal Protection. I want to start by welcoming all of you to this very important event. I am sure there is a lot in there that you will be grappling with, thinking, what is this all about? I recognize that a number of you may have been in previous events that we have organized before, including those who will be online right now. But suffice it to say that perhaps to a large extent what we are going to be discussing today, tomorrow, may not necessarily be new. We may, however, be throwing different perspectives to the subject matter. As you all will agree with us, food and the systems through which we produce food that we consume is central to our well-being as human beings. We are an animal welfare organization, and we have chosen like others will have done, whether in the animal welfare sector, in the health sector, in any sector for that matter, will make a very conscious choice. So we have made that conscious choice. As you will see in many of our communication, our vision is very clear. Our mission is equally clear. And we are humbled by the reality that, given the vision that we espouse, and faced with a reality that we all know, we have coined a mission that speaks to the reality that until and unless we gather together, we agree together, we work together, we may not necessarily realize that vision. But somebody somewhere has to provide leadership. And it is that leadership that we at World Animal Protection have decided to offer. We are a global organization, but within the global context, we also believe that the objective of ensuring that animals live a good life may not be fully realized until Africa is part of the solution. Because Africa has a fundamental role to play. In our new strategy, not new anymore, which will be with us until 2030, we have made a bold statement, friends. Some of you may have come across that statement already, but it is important we continue to remind ourselves. And we have said that for the next 10 years, we will ensure that animals enjoy a new world. And there is a lot in there. Part of that new world that we envisage for animals, friends, is a world where the food systems that you and I are part of will be disrupted so that whatever happens to animals does not lead to cruelty and suffering. Because we believe that the current food system is not good enough because it allows for massive suffering and cruelty of animals. The current food systems around the world really should be held to account. And if you hold the food systems to account, you basically want to hold the actors that are involved in the food systems to account. Who are the actors? The actors can be at global level, they could be at regional level, they could be at national level, they could be at village level. It is that we have made very clear that we want to make sure we interrogate. Because billions and billions of animals go through the global food system to satisfy our needs as human beings. Unfortunately, we have been largely selfish in the process because we have only looked at our own interests. Research that we conducted that led us to the strategy that we espouse, friends, suggests that there is a deepening crisis facing animals around the world. There is a deepening crisis facing animals around the world. As if that is not enough, our findings suggest that the scale of the suffering that the animals face is very alarming. So you can imagine the degree to which the problem is. The crisis is not only deepening. Again, as if that is not enough, the scale is alarming, suggesting that you and I need to do something about it. As a matter of fact, population continues to grow. And that growing population seems to be heavily reliant on food systems through which animals continue to bear serious suffering. As an organization, as I said earlier on, we are humbled by the reality that the problem is so enormous that we cannot mislead ourselves to think that it is only us who work for the organization that will offer solution. So we are saying that together we will change the way the world works. You and I, all of us in this room, those who are following online, those in the villages, those who act at global level, those who operate at regional level, all of us together will change the way the world works to end cruelty and suffering. And we will do that not haphazardly. We will do that with a systemic approach in mind so that the solutions we offer will last forever. Friends, the issue we are grappling with when it comes to food systems and the implications for animals is not far from us. We are seated in this nice building, Ole Serena. But I'm telling you, if you jump into a vehicle and look northeast of this city, nobody needs to tell you. The county governor for Mandera was saying on the news that the animals that have succumbed to the drought will value somewhere in the region of 11 billion Kenyan shillings. Whilst that is important, for us it is not the economic value that is more important. It is the suffering of every single animal that has died that is our issue. And I am not downplaying the economic value of that loss. But I am saying, whilst it is important to look at the economic value of the loss, it is more important from our point of view, and we all know apologies, because those animals do not need to die because there is no food. The same thing is happening to human beings. And it is as a result of the practices that human beings have set out. Climate change has been with us before you and I were born. So it's a reality. The question is, do we accept that reality? Is it okay? I think the answer is it is not okay. We will not accept. So we need to do something. So in our strategy, where we have stated 2 strategic objectives, one of them focuses on ensuring that farm animals live good lives by transforming the global food system. That is a mouthful. That is ambitious. Ensuring farm animals live good lives by transforming the global food system, not by transforming the village food system. But the village food system is part of the global food system. The national food system is part of the global food system. The regional food system is part of the global food system. So the global food system is a reflection of the entire planet Earth system of food production. And that is what we say we want to transform. We have gone on further to say, in order to transform the global food systems, we will explore, among other things, 3 intervention areas. But for the purposes of today's business and up until tomorrow, we are focusing on 2 intervention areas. The first one, and this is based on clear research and evidence, is that we will ensure that there will be no future for factory farming. Because we believe that factory farming is one of the major contributors to the problem that we face. One will argue that they disagree. We have no problem with anybody disagreeing, but we are convinced beyond all reasonable doubt that the current global food system, from a factory farming point of view, should not have a future. The second that we have said is that we will kickstart a food revolution. Friends, don't get us wrong. We are very conscious that Africa, for example, is food insecure. But 2 wrongs cannot make one right. 2 wrongs cannot make one right. Whilst Africa is food insecure, there is drought. So we need to do something about why this is the case. For over 60 years, before you and I were born, that is the situation we face. So we need a food revolution. We need to consider alternatives to our approach. We cannot keep doing the same thing year in, year out, and expect that we will get a different result. If we do the same thing year in, year out, we are more than likely to get the same result. And that is what this is really about. We are not about trying to put people out of business. So for the corporate sector, the supermarkets, the restaurants, World Animal Protection is not about putting people out of business. It's about raising a consciousness that the world we live in needs to be responsive to the realities. And these two intervention areas, insofar as the Africa Protein Summit that our 2 days gathering here is about, they really overlap. In the context of the African Protein Summit, or the discussions around alternative proteins, we must look at factory farming and put an end to factory farming. We can still, and that's our belief, have sufficient food available for every single human being on planet Earth without necessarily pursuing the current architecture of factory farming. We can still feed from animal protein, but from high welfare systems. Let us be clear. World Animal Protection is not about anti-meat. It is not about anti-meat, but meat from high welfare production systems where animals do not needlessly suffer. That is the point. At the same time, we are saying we must consider alternative sources of proteins such that the over-reliance on animal protein as the only, as the alpha and the omega, as the beginning and the end is not the case because there is so much around. But in the context of climate change, it's not even helping. So when world leaders and everyone else perhaps joining world leaders to gather in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year to look at climate change, we are suggesting that our agricultural systems, which we believe contributes to climate change, must be interrogated. So the considerations around this protein summit that we are having today and tomorrow is to begin to explore that. Climate change is with us, and Africa can perhaps only survive from an adaptation point of view. How are we going to adapt? One of the ways we feel we should adapt is to consider the way we want to continue with our food production systems. So I want to welcome all of you. I want to thank you, those who are online, for prioritizing this. We are starting a conversation. We are hoping that we will come up with a joint statement as civil society actors who are offering alternative considerations for this very important subject, and hope that those who are responsible authorities who make policy decisions on behalf of governments around the world will begin to consider this as an alternative proposal that we are putting on the table. The climate change conversation over time has been focused on fossil fuel as perhaps the only problem. Greenhouse gas emissions are a reality, and we are believing that the argument we are offering from an animal agriculture point of view in terms of its contribution to the problem will be taken seriously. Once again, I want to welcome you, and I hope you have very good deliberations up until tomorrow. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Tennyson. We can clap for him again. Yeah, and again, thank you for those who are joining us online. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. Write your name and the organization that you're working from, and also the country that we are coming from. Thank you. Now I'll welcome Dr. Victor Yamo to come and talk to us about these global food systems. What is it? What does it concern us? Victor.
Good morning. Unlike Tennyson, I feel if I have that, I'll become a preacher. So I'd prefer to stand and make my contribution to this topic. Good mornings to those who are online. Let me try and organize myself. I will be talking about trends and impacts of global food systems. The slide that you're seeing is what I normally say the most important slide that you'll see today, because it gives you a contact where you can do subsequent follow-ups. And it's great to see those of us who are here and also those of us who are online. A lot of things that we were going to start with, Tennyson has already alluded to. And so I will skip a few slides because Tennyson has highlighted most of the things that are there. Our vision is a world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering. And our mission is we move the world to protect animals. And I think we just want to lay emphasis on the fact that we is all of us, not World Animal Protection staffers. And those in the room and those online, this is part of your mandate to ensure that animals are protected and they live a life worth living. We work around about 14 country offices, and the Africa office is situated in Nairobi. And that's what the map is trying to show. And then about a year ago, we launched our global strategy, A New World for Animals. And for those who can get the link, you can actually, the link is under, on the slide, you can actually look at that because it gives details of what Tennyson was alluding to. And it also tells you what are the two areas that you work around. One being, goal one being ensuring farmed animals live good lives by transforming the global food system, and that is why we are here today. And the second one is about wildlife, stopping wild animals being cruelly exploited as commodities by changing the systems that allow it to happen. So we are basically a food system and wildlife organization. Those of us who know us from earlier on, we have dropped the certain other areas that we used to work in, but created an organization that works around those. And if you need more information, you can actually contact us and we'll let you know. I've tried to compress from my strategy class the farming systems into one slide or one page. On your left is the problem. At the bottom is the drivers of the problems. And then the three interventions that we want to work around. No future for factory farms, catalyzing a food revolution, and fairer finance. And then the outcomes that we are hoping to come through by 2030 when the strategy runs out. I think, again, I won't belabor them. Once, for those who are interested, we can share the slides and you can have a quick look at them. If there's any questions, then you can get back to us. No future for factory farms. Just to look at the key focus is exactly what Tennyson has said, and trying to ensure that we do not allow factory farms to take root in Africa specifically, and to ensure that those factory farms are not allowed to continue developing or providing food. And the reasons why that is being said and the research around those things are something that part of these slides will try, this presentation will try and address the impacts we are seeing and why it's becoming very clear that you cannot continue to have factory farms or intensive farming systems allowed. And then food revolution is about changing our diets. And again, we'll use this presentation to show you where we are in terms of consumption of meat and meat products and what alternatives we have. And tomorrow we have somebody who will be looking at it from a government perspective or a nutritionist perspective to give us better details. And then fairer finance is just chasing the finance. He who pays the piper determines the songs that can be played. And so we are just trying to find out who's funding farming in Africa, specifically again, and what kind of funding are they, what kind of farming are they funding? Because that then drives the process around whether we're actually doing the right thing or whether the fundings that are coming from both development partners or directly from private finance institutions are actually part of the problem that we need to be addressing. So that was the introduction, and as I said, I would rush through it because Tennyson had alluded to a lot of it. So what is the global food system? I think that's where we need to start, because at this point I know some of us are not where we are, and we need to bring us together onto the same space. So ideally, the global food system is just a system that encompasses the entire range of actors and their interlinked value-adding activities involved in production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal of food products. That becomes very critical. It's the holistic thing that we need to be looking at. It needs to be sustainable, and you're saying a sustainable food system is a food system that delivers food security and nutrition for all of us in such a way that the economic, social, and environmental basis to generate food security and nutrition for future generations is not compromised. And I think that's the challenge we are having with the current farming system, that it is destroying the environmental bits, it's not remaining sustainable, and we are compromising the capacity for future generations to actually generate food, which is becoming critical, as we will show. In my school of thoughts, having made presentations severally, a diagram explains what we are talking about quite well. And so I have borrowed a diagram there that shows what a global food system looks like. It's actually up at the top, you see there's farming. And farming is essentially what we are talking about. We have inputs that go into farming, we have outputs that go into farming, and those are the things that we need to start looking at. Of critical importance is then the other facets or areas that then that farming is engaged with. When you talk to small-scale farmers, sometimes you would get the feeling that the whole of their farming involves around their farm. But that farm interacts with an economic system, the retailers, the processors, the distributors, the fast food restaurants. If that economic engagement does not generate funds or does not generate a profit for the farmer, it means that the farmer then is not able to be sustainable. And that is something that we need to be looking at and very important. But around that farming systems, there are also rules and regulations that needs to be developed. And that is done in a political system. Certain policies, certain bills must go to Parliament or National Assembly must then pass them for whichever country you are from. So essentially what we are saying is that the farming system then also engages the political system because it needs to be regulated. And those regulations are actually generated by the political side of it. Then the social aspects is why we have social bakers in the room today. A lot of us are beginning to follow what is happening in farming system and in our consumption habits, which have drastically changed over years because of the engagement of what we see on social media, on digital platforms, and that is becoming very critical. So things like the traditional foods that we used to eat, how do they relate to what is happening currently? The influx of fast food restaurants into the continent is something that we need to be looking at and be alive to. What is driving it? Basically, part of it is what we are seeing as we engage socially and digitally at certain levels. And then, of course, the food system also engages the environment. And part of the reason why we are having this discussion is the impact it's having on the environment that is leading to climate change. And that is part of the reasons why then we need to look at it holistically. So it's difficult to then discuss a global food system if you're not looking at all those facets. If you're not looking at the policy arena, if you're not looking at the social discussions around what is happening on the social arena, if you're not looking at the political system, if you're not looking at the biological and the environmental system. And that is why we then need to look at some of these things. Now to narrow it down then, what is factory farming? Because I think that's also critical for us to understand. It's also known as industrial livestock production system or industrial livestock system. Essentially what we are saying from an animal welfare perspective, it's a system that does not recognize sentience of animals. Yeah? That does not recognize sentience of animals. It does not recognize the fact that the animal can feel, can experience, and needs to be catered for, and we need to ensure that the 5 fundamental freedoms for animal welfare are then engaged and looked at. Its goal is to minimize costs and maximize profits, to quickly produce large supplies of meat that vary at very low cost all year round. The reality is that it's unsustainable. And the reasons why it's unsustainable, some of them are listed there. It needs a lot of animal feeds being produced, and that's part of where the destruction of the environment starts. Because you need to grow large amounts of soya and large amounts of maize to then put into the diet. And what you're seeing happening globally is that a lot of that leads to destruction of forests and leading to loss of biodiversity, which then ultimately leads to climate change because the soil is not being regenerated and the forest cover that we require is being eliminated. It also uses a lot of chemicals, and as we'll show, the chemicals that goes into that production system ultimately ends up on our plates if certain production processes are not adhered to. And last but not least, it's also challenging to manage the whole the waste management of that process. And that is something that we also need to start addressing. The amount of tons of manure that come from these production systems, where do we take them? And what do we do with them? In most cases, if you're looking at it from an African perspective, a lot of it will be used to grow crops. If there's been any problem at the poultry or pig house or the production system, and you've used a chemical, antibiotic for instance, that chemical will then be found on the crops that you're growing, and ultimately if there's rain runoff, you'll find it in streams. And that's part of some work that we've done with Calro over this year, a report that we'll be launching early next year. So the reality is that the system is not sustainable because it is destroying the environment, because it is contaminating the environment, and it's leading to climate change at certain levels. But factory farming is also destructive in terms of the impact it has on workers. And research done across the world shows that in the appalling conditions that animals are raised, the workers' rights or workers' welfare are also not catered for. But from an animal welfare perspective, there are also unacceptable practices that drives that process. There are things like close confinement. At the bottom of the page there, you can see chickens in a battery cage system, which is beginning to be rejected across the world. The interesting thing is that as it's being rejected across the world, and especially in the developed countries, it is coming to Africa with funding for farmers to get engaged in it, while some of the big production systems are already, big retailers are beginning to say that they would not accept eggs from that production system. There are things like early weaning, poorly ventilated environments which lead to respiratory problems that lead to pandemics and zoonotic diseases, and then we also have painful mutilations that we need to be looking at. But above all, the animals are also growing extremely fast, and I think in the poultry industry there's already a discussion around the need to slow down the capacity of the broiler to grow as fast as it's currently growing. And I think those are the discussions that we need to be looking at. Above all, of great importance is that factory farming is one of the major contributors to excessive use of antibiotics. It is estimated that about 75% of antibiotics that are globally produced end up in farming systems, and predominantly being used to mask poor welfare in production systems, and something that we then need to look at. So what are some of the key trends that we are looking at, which is driving that process and leading to the need for us to start looking at alternative ways to manage production systems? I want to start by the fact that it is known that on the African continent, population is growing at an extremely fast rate, and we need to feed those Africans that are being produced every year. It is estimated that between 2015 and 2050, the population of Africa will literally double from 1.2 billion people to about 2.4 billion people by 2050. Those people need to be fed. And the myth that has gone out there is that factory farming would be the solution to the problem. However, as we are going to show, that is part of the challenges that we need to be looking at, because it is not actually solving the problem, but creating other problems that need to be addressed. So growing population is one of the trends that we're looking at. Urbanization is another critical one. A lot of us are coming into urban settings where we then find jobs, which gives us better prosperity, economic prosperity, which drives change, the fact that we demand for animal products. Apparently in the African setting, when you reach or when you have achieved, then you need to eat certain products from animals, especially meat and meat products. And that's part of what is driving what we are looking at. Just to show you what is happening globally, in around 1961, globally, we used to consume about 70 million metric tons of meat, total meat combined. In 2018, we were consuming about 330 million metric tons. And remember, that's for about 7.3 billion people globally. So if you would then push it to 9.4 billion people, 9 billion people by 2050, you can see the demand that is going to be there. Of course, as the diagram shows, the most consumed animals are the top two, chickens and pigs, and that's why there's concentration around those two production systems as we go along. And that's just to summarize and to tell you that exactly what I've said. I think the important one is the statement at the bottom that says that between now and 2050, again, the consumption of meat is literally going to double from about 14 kilos per person per year in Africa to about 26 kilos per person per year in Africa. And that is something that is also critical. But you can notice from the graph that there are countries where we are consuming up to about 160 kilos per person per year. And that is something that needs to be addressed as we go forth. Just to then contextualize it into the African situation, you can see that the heaviest consumption in Africa is actually in South Africa, where they're consuming about 59 kilos per person per year of meat. And they're as low as Rwanda, where we are doing about 6 kilos per person per year. I think that's where the challenge then becomes when you look at what Enison was talking about around the food revolution. Is it fair enough to tell Africans not to eat meat when their consumption of meat is way below the acceptable levels? And that's where then there's that challenge and debate that we're having, and part of the reason why we asked you to join us today, to then say, what does Africa need to do to meet their nutritional requirements, and what is the actually recommended amount of meat that somebody should eat on a day-by-day basis. That then would drive the conversation on to, do we need factory farms, or do we have a production system, an alternative one that is already meeting that requirement? And beyond that, must we eat meat, or is there an alternative source of proteins that we can be looking at? FAO tells us that there'll be growth about 5.9% or 6% growth in beef production and consumption, about 13% in pork, and 17 or 18% in poultry, with poultry meat representing 41% of proteins that will be consumed by 2030. And that's something that, again, we then need to ask ourselves, what production system do we need to then have to drive that process and ensure that the animals that are being used for that production reaches the minimum requirement standards, or what we call, or known as farmed animal responsible minimum standards. Our addiction of meat is fueling other things, as we've started to discuss. It's fueling the fact that we are beginning to see climate change as an issue. It's fueling pollution. It's fueling antibiotic resistance, and it's destroying wildlife habitats, and we're losing biodiversity because of the need to have big farms where you can keep those animals, but also the need to have spaces to grow products that are used in feed production systems. Just as a start, I'll just pass through climate change, but in my second presentation, we'll be looking at climate change closely, because this one, we want to deal with matters relating to health and health-related, or certain things that have been pointed out as pathways that are coming out from intensive farming systems. In terms of climate change, it is estimated that about 26% of greenhouse gases comes from production systems, from our agriculture. In terms of the supply chain, the fuels that they use, the actual production, livestock production and husbandry processes can account for about 31% of the 26%. And then, of course, growing crops for feed account for a certain percentage that is critical. So essentially, we are saying that the discussion needs to start including agriculture, especially livestock agriculture, because there's a certain amount of greenhouse gases that is actually coming from production systems, and not to concentrate on fossil fuels alone. Land use and changes in land use, especially what is you can see on the bottom left of the of the slide, deforestation, agriculture, demand for animal source foods, and urbanization, that is driving changes in land use, is ultimately then also contributing to climate change, because part of it is the fact that the soil is not able to regenerate itself, and that then leads to part of what we are seeing as climate change. Yeah. But I also want to say that in the last few years, certain things have happened that we need to take cognizance of. When I joined the organization in 2015, the United Nations endorsed Agenda 2030, and I think as we go into this discussion, one of the things we need to start appreciating as Africans on the continent is the role of Agenda 2030. When I go to certain spaces and ask what Agenda 2030 is, I get blank stares because people have not been tracking. But Agenda 2030 is basically the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need to start looking at them critically, and our contribution into meeting them by 2030 has been proposed by the UN. Around the same time, there was the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which then started driving the process around the COP meetings that we are seeing. And it's becoming critical to then have a holistic engagement in climate change discussions, not on fossil fuels alone, but also on contribution from agriculture. In 2017, the continent then launched the Animal Welfare Strategy for Africa. And I think it's something then again we also need to start looking at and seeing how we domesticate it, because it has very clear proposals and very clear policy strategies that we need to be looking at, because that then drives animal welfare. In fact, from people who've engaged with the Animal Welfare Strategy for Africa, they tend to feel that it is heavily leaning towards production systems, and that is something that then drives the process of what we're trying to say. But early this year, on this continent, again in Nairobi, Kenya, there was the UNEA 5.2 resolution. And it's very interesting that a United Nations environmental program was able to connect that poor animal welfare has an impact on the environment. And I think that's what part of the discussion we need to be looking at. UNEA 5.2 talks about the nexus, or the connection between animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development goals, and or sustainable development. And it's something that we need to also be alive to the report that is being developed by the Director General for UNEA to be presented in the next year's meeting, because it's starting to look at that connection between animal welfare and production systems, and what happens in environmental health, human health, and planetary health, because those things are very important and critical. So let's go to the impact pathways, or the things that we are looking at, and why we are saying that we need to look at and have a rethink on the protein consumption on the continent, and things that then needs to be looked at critically. The pathways are based on a report known as the Hidden Health Impacts of Industrial Livestock Systems that we generated or produced early this year, and was launched, I think, a month or two back. And that report is based on the World Health Organization's report on food systems delivering better health that was done by World Health Organization in 2021. So essentially, people are beginning to look at food systems and its contribution to health, because there are certain things that are becoming very clear that if you don't look at it critically, we might miss the boat and end up having more challenges than we are trying to resolve by nutrition. That report recognizes about 5 pathways that we need to look at critically, that production system of global food systems is contributing into human health. One is unhealthy diets and food insecurity. So while we are saying factory farms or industrial farming should be the basis for food security, the report from World Health Organization, which we have based our research on, is telling us otherwise, that in fact, that system is generating more food insecurity, and we will look at it at a certain level. It's also generating more zoonotic pathogens and antimicrobial resistance. The way we are producing animals is generating more pandemics, so to speak, and it's also bringing diseases that can cross from humans to animals and vice versa. It's also leading to unsafe and adulterated foods, and we'll look at it. And as I alluded to earlier on, it's also leading to environmental contamination and degradation. And of course, last but not least, occupational hazards that is important to look at. So I want to pick each one of them as I wind up and just highlight one or two things about those. When you get the slides, the references at the bottom, you can actually do further reading, and if you need to engage us on more of that, we can then have a discussion, especially in the afternoon when we are having the discussion session, so that we get to understand really what is happening. In terms of malnutrition and obesity, in terms of unhealthy diets and food insecurity, it has been shown by World Health Organization and certain research that has been done by other researchers that our production system is actually contributing, or our food system is actually contributing to malnutrition. And the nutrition expert told me malnutrition is both positively and negatively. And when it's positive, it becomes obesity. So essentially, and I can see my good friend Doreen laughing at the gentleman who is not the expert. So anyway, the fact is that obesity is being seen, and it is said that excessive meat consumption is leading to 1 out of 4 of us ending up with chronic illness. And tomorrow, the presenter from a nutritional point of view will give you more facts and data around that. It is costing the world about $2 trillion US annually just to manage obesity. Yeah? And that's the kind of thing we are talking about. And pathways around factory farming produces high volume of cheap meat, which then leads to a lot of consumption of meat, which ultimately then leads to, at certain levels, obesity and malnutrition that we are talking about. So that's one of the things that we need to be looking at, and the reason why as an organization we are saying we need to rethink our production system and our food systems to ensure that it is not contributing. Because if you can save $2 trillion dollars globally, it can go into a lot of other things that would make the world a better place for some people to live in. Yeah? The second one is around zoonotic pathogens and antimicrobial resistance. And essentially we are saying that antimicrobial resistance, and I alluded to the fact that about 73 to 75% of antibiotic produced globally ends up in production system. And both OIE and World Health Organization has clearly shown that the reason why we use excessive antibiotics in production system is because we have a poor welfare, a low welfare production system. The animals have poor ventilation, their needs are not catered for, the fundamental freedoms are not catered for, they are not fed well at certain levels. The environment is heavily contaminated because we've packed too many of them into a small space, the stocking density is all wrong, and all those things then lead to a container, so to speak, where a lot of virus mutations can happen and a lot of genetic material is being changed among certain viruses, which then leads to pathogens that become zoonotic, and that's where, in fact, research done by, I think it's research done by UNEP and ILRI just at the beginning of the pandemic clearly showed that between 1940 and now, 50% of the pandemics actually came from farming systems. And that is why there's a need to look at and rethink that farming system. So you can actually look at it. The report is entitled Preventing the Next Pandemic, Zoonotic Diseases and How to Break the Chain of Transmission. So that's part of why we are saying production systems need to be looked at and interrogated to ensure that they are not causing any other problems. Beyond that, some of the zoonotic diseases we've seen over the last couple of years that are part of what we are talking about are things like avian influenza that came from our production system and was really devastating in the early 2012, 2010, 2012, for those of us who were in industry at that point. But there's been other things, SARS, Ebola, and MERS that can be related to antigenic shifts or processes that have happened, including COVID, which was said to have come from a wet market. They are all somehow remotely or directly related to production systems. This one is about AMR. I'm not going to belabor the fact, but it said today that we lose about 700,000. Actually, research done by a team in the UK last year showed that we actually lose about 1.27 million people annually because they have contacted diseases that cannot be treated. And part of it is because of the use of antibiotics in production systems. It is estimated that at the rate we are going, there'll be a 67% increase in use of antibiotics in production systems in the low to middle income countries. And that is something that we need to address. How then do we ensure that our production systems is high welfare, which then negates the use of antibiotics? And that, if we don't do anything about antibiotic use, by 2050 we'll be losing 10 million people every year due to deaths because of diseases that cannot be treated by the substances that are available. So again, critical reasons why we need to look at production systems critically. The next one is number 3 is unsafe and adulterated foods. And essentially we are saying that foodborne diseases and illnesses occur because production systems are not at the level they are supposed to be. The likes of salmonellosis and certain other diseases that go through foods. When we did our supermarket meat testing in the country last year, in 2020, one of the things that came out clearly was the fact that we had salmonella contamination in products that were at the shelf in supermarkets. And that is something that we need to then relook at the production system to find out where the contamination could be coming from. It is estimated that foodborne illnesses is costing us about $110 billion every year. And it's costing about 420,000 deaths as at 2010. So again, something that we then need to look at in production system and the global food system is how then do we manage that process of the chemicals and contaminants that can come from the production systems to ensure that animals are not part of the problem, but are sorted out. Just to give you an example, I think a year or two back, malaria killed about 409,000 people globally, while foodborne illness killed about 475,000 people globally. And out of those, a big chunk of them, almost two-thirds of that proportion came from Africa and Asia, the low to middle income countries. And you can see the total amount of money that it costed us. So again, we need to start managing our animals in a way that then they are not contributing to unsafe foods for that matter. That's just an example to show you what non-typhoidal salmonella mortalities look like. And you can see the biggest concentration of the mortality is actually in Africa and a bit in Asia. Again, the low and middle income countries, and something that we need to be looking at. A lot of these things come through the poultry production systems. And that's why we say again that that production system needs to be looked at afresh. As we come towards the end, environmental contamination is the other one, and we talked about two things. One, the amount of pesticides that are being used to grow the maize and soya that goes into production systems, and that pesticide then remains in the food and ultimately gets onto your plate. But the other thing is the manure that is coming out of this production system, heavy amount of manure. If they're contaminated with antimicrobial resistant genes or residues or any other contaminants, then ultimately they end up on the food chain. And it's something that, as I said and alluded to, we are currently doing a research piece with Kenya Agriculture Livestock Research Organization trying to track what happens in the production farm, how it ends up in manure, and when manure is used on crops, is there contamination then spread? And if it's spread, if there's rain runoff in where there are streams, does it end up in the streams? Very interesting findings, as I alluded to, and we'll be releasing the report early next year. I want to skip occupational hazards. It was not really a big issue in Africa, but the reality is that where poor production systems are part of the process, then you end up in a situation where you also end up with workers' welfare not being catered for. And as is indicated there in the US, up to 40% or higher are production systems where the workers' welfare are not catered for, and then that negatively impacts on the worker. But when the worker is demotivated, then it has impacts on the production system, especially on the welfare of the animal, because the animal then gets mishandled and its welfare is compromised. So again, very important for us from an animal welfare perspective. So as we are coming to conclusion, then the organization as World Animal Protection, we are saying we need to start having not only the discussion, but we also need to have certain paradigm shifts on our thought processes as we try to start grappling with what factory farming or intensive livestock production system is contributing in the global food systems. And some of the shifts that we're looking at is one, a shift of mindsets. We need to start accepting and recognizing the fact that planetary health and high welfare are interconnected. And they are not only interconnected, the two of them, but they're also then interconnected to human health. So you are not going to have good human health and well-being and happiness if we are mishandling animals, because of that connection which even UNEP has recognized and said we need to do a report for UNEP 6.0 next year to see the connections between animal welfare, environmental health, and planetary health. Very important. The second thing is to start saying, can we have a transition? And that's why we've called you today to start having this discussion. Can you say what do we need to do as Africa to still feed ourselves, but feed ourselves without causing problems to the animal and problems to the environment, which then impact on us negatively. We also need to shift to sustainable and healthy diets. And I think from our initial discussion and foray into this arena, it's very clear that there are African diets which were very rich. I'm happy to see nutritionists here who can then tell us, in our traditional setups, what were these diets that were very rich? Why are we losing them? Is there something we can do to conserve them? In fact, as an organization, we are beginning to think that sometime next year we should have an African traditional food exhibition, so that we start picking what was good from our traditional setups and ensure that they are not lost as we modernize or innovate into production systems. Beyond that, we're also looking at your power to influence. In the last few years, as we've worked with corporates, the fact that certain people can tweet to a corporate and say, you need to be part of the bandwagon, you need to have an animal welfare policy, you need to have a policy that speaks around some of these things, has seen us drive certain corporates to a level where they have now they're beginning to have animal welfare policies, food safety policies, policies around use of antimicrobials that is critical and important. We also need to have a shift towards higher animal welfare standards, and as an organization, we are talking about ensuring that we have what is called farmed animal responsible minimum standards, which then drive production systems so that production systems meet certain basic minimum requirements. We are saying that that is the basic requirement. A good farmer or a good producer should at least adhere to farmed animal responsible minimum standards, because it drives the production system into a higher welfare production system that caters for the animal. We also need to look at things from a one health, one welfare shift. Clearly, as you can see from this presentation, the human health is interconnected to animal health and to environmental health. And so we are saying, can we have a shift where we then look at things from a one health perspective, not the three silos that we've been working from traditionally. As we conclude, we then want to recommend certain things. One is governments must recognize the interconnection and the one health, public health sort of thing that we are talking about, and see how we can start stopping support for factory farms. The second thing we are saying is we need to develop national plans to support a just transition. And in certain situations, we have actually developed what are known as nationally determined contributions or national climate action plans. In fact, this country, Kenya, the Kenyan one I know was done in 2017. The challenge is that most of us are not even aware what's on the document. And those are the discussions that we want us to start happening. If we have a nationally determined action plan or nationally determined contributions document or policy, why is it that we are not adhering to it? What are we actually doing to ensure that we meet those standards? In Africa, the other countries, if they are not there, I know several countries have developed them. How do we work towards ensuring that we have them so that we drive that process? I've already talked about farms, the farmed animal responsible minimum standards. And, okay, we are stuck. Yeah, my last two slides looks like they've become stuck. Okay, yeah, just to conclude, that we need to develop a national One Health forum. Incidentally, for the Kenyan one, we already have, and I know several African countries also have a One Health strategy. The Kenyan one was launched early this year. So again, some of the things we are talking about are already available. And it's just sensitizing the masses to ensure that we then adhere to them and work around them to ensure that we are able to drive that process. With those few remarks, I hope I have, at the very least, started you into a process of thinking through what we are looking at in terms of production systems and the food systems and where we are. There are several other presentations that will be coming after this one, which will delve more deeper into some of what we are actually seeing. When you're seeing climate drought, like we're seeing in this country currently, is the drought a sequelae of a poor production system, or is the poor production system a sequelae of drought in an attempt to produce more food? I would want to leave it at that point, and we would want to invite Dr. Mwinde to then pick up the discussions from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that presentation. You'll agree with me it was comprehensive, and I hope you paid good attention to that because it forms a good background to group discussions that we'll be having. Because the idea is to try to reflect on these presentations and see the key issues being raised here, see what resonates well with us here in Africa, and come up with issues which you think will get the attention that you're seeking for. So I understand we are slightly behind the time, but so that we don't carry things forward, I will ask you to pose any questions for Dr. Yamo so that he can be able to respond to them, because when he come back, we'll be having a different presenter. Those online, please post your questions in the chat box. Then we'll be able to read them to Dr. Victor Yamo. So questions, clarifications, comments, please feel free to raise that. Yeah, when you're asking question, say your name so that Victor can refer to you when he's responding to them.
My name is Dr. Paul Kangede. I'm a veterinary journalist from KTN News. Thank you, Dr. Yamo, for such a powerful presentation. And my question is, with the continuing pressure, as from the numbers you've shown on the demand for animal protein, that is beef, chicken, and pork. So, like, when we are talking about the farms, how well are farmers aware about the details therein so that they can be able to produce well and taking care of those animals? Because if we say we shift the discussion maybe to plant-based proteins, that may not be an immediate result or an immediate strategy or something that we can go to immediately. But before we shift to that direction, what are the steps that farmers should take in farms to make sure that, at least for the numbers they are producing of animals, that their animals are produced in a better environment? Thank you.
Thank you, Doc, for that question. Any other person? Yeah, over there.
Thank you. My name is Kevin. I wanted to ask, like, the main objective of world animal production is to protect the welfare of animals. And from the talk, we have been told that as a country, we lose 11 billion shillings a year. What is the world animal production doing to combat this? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other here before we go to our online participants? Okay, yeah, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Dennis Kipkorir, working for Farming Systems Kenya. From the discussion, you are saying we may want to shift to plant proteins. But then again, from your slides, I could see that is a contribution on the use of pesticides in agriculture to AMR. So maybe we may need to again qualify it and say, is the protein the problem or AMR?
Okay, thank you, Dr. for that question. Yes, Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Francis Jonge. I just wanted to find out the National One Health Strategy. You know, we could probably be just talking to ourselves. And this encompasses participation for all of us. You know, because, and with all due respect to human doctors, probably, are they seeing this picture? Are they seeing how it is going to affect them? Because we didn't need to bring everybody on board. We could be talking to ourselves. I know we are trying to do everything possible, but then how far have we gone into bringing them and bringing everyone who is concerned in this matter? Because we will not make it if we don't work together. So that everybody understands from the word go why we are talking about this kind of farming system and how it affects all of us. So how far are we in ensuring that we are working together? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. that is clear enough. Don't need to repeat that. Any final one before I hand over the mic to Victor? Yes, two more. Let's take a lady
first. My name is Nazaria Nyaga. I'd like to find out what the organization is doing to engage the political class on this issue, because as you have described, the political class or the political aspect is very much important in the food system cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. for that. Then final one.
Thank you very much. My name is Festus Lagat from MediaMax. My question goes to Dr. About 2 weeks ago, Kenya left ban of genetically modified organism, that is GMO. As people from ASU, what's your take on that?
Okay, thank you all for these questions. Yes.
I have requested that I deal with the people here first while they find out what is happening online. I will start with what I think is the easiest, Prof's question. Prof, the reality is that the One Health strategy was actually developed by everybody. But I feel you, and I hear you loud and clear, because government has been able to develop certain strategies that has not been driven out of the shelves. And so we have a strategy, just like I said, the NCDs, we have a national, the climate determinants policy that was done in 2017, but 90%, I'm sure if I polled here, maybe 95% of us have never heard of it or even seen the document. The same applies. The One Health policy was done together. It was driven through Zoonotic Diseases Unit, which brings together medics and vets. They sit in Kenyatta National Hospital. But unfortunately, then it was discovered that the environment part of it was not put into it, and so there's been discussions around that. I think it's a beautiful strategy because it actually pushes counties to create what you are calling a County One Health platform. So that the approach to outbreaks of diseases like Rift Valley fever and anthrax is then approached holistically, so that the team that is going to investigate and advise the county is actually from a One Health platform. And I think that's where we need to be headed. In the AMR, just to then bring it to conclusion, in the AMR sector, we have now a national steering committee that is a One Health sort of thing, because it brings the medics, the vets, and the environmentalists. The delivery of the national action plans and the policy around AMR is actually a very good a very good example of how One Health works, because any meeting, I know there's a meeting on Thursday, Friday morning, Thursday is a holiday. There will be vets and medics and pharmacists and environmentalists all talking about what we need to do about managing antimicrobial resistance. So it's a start, but I think you're right, we need to drive that process. In fact, I would be happy if we can get all of us to have a copy of the One Health strategy to look at it and see where you can fit into that process. My good friend Dennis from Farming System, as an organization, we are not saying we move to plants. We are just saying that we need to eat meat, but high welfare produced meat that caters for the animal itself. And even as we look at the high welfare productions, we need to look at the other things that are added to that production system. And a good example, as you alluded to, is antimicrobial use. And that's why, as an organization, we've worked with like-minded organizations to develop things like guidelines for prudent use of antimicrobials in production systems. We've even worked with the OIE to develop, or World Organization for Animal Health, to develop biosecurity manuals for poultry, pigs, and dairy production systems. And we are still working with other partners around some of these things because they are important, critical and important, so that this food that gets onto your table is actually holistic. Yeah? And that's part of what we are looking at. For Kevin, I know we've lost animals worth 1 billion shillings. As an organization, there are certain limitations. Our core mandate is exactly what we are doing right now. That mandate belongs to certain other people who need to take their responsibility seriously. And I think as an organization, the best we can do is to advocate and to engage the right sectors. We've had meetings with certain spaces to just try and drive the narrative that as an organization, as a country, we need to be prepared for droughts. Yeah, there are drought mitigation strategies that need to be in place, and there are warning systems that are already in place. It's just that either because of elections, government did not take the precautionary measures that they needed to do, and those are things that beyond the mandate of World Animal Protection, but we engage at certain levels around some of these things. Paul, it's true, farmer awareness, and that's the reason why we keep engaging farmers. I know you and I were out for World Egg Day in Nakuru engaging farmers, and we engage farmers in all platforms. Because essentially we are saying farmers need to understand the connections. If you do poor welfare, if you do not feed the animal well, if you do not give it a comfortable environment, if you don't manage disease out processes for the animal and do proper biosecurity, disease prevention, vaccinations, and then allow the animal to express its naturalness and not have stress, you will not have a good product and productivity goes down. I think between 2015 when I joined the organization and now, there's been significant moves around some of these things. There's been also moves just to then answer what Nazaria was asking about. There's also been engagement with government to do certain regulations that cater for some of these things. But from my perspective, my personal perspective, it is better to raise awareness so that people do the right thing than to regulate them and start being punitive. Because, for instance, if you use CAP 360, the current CAP 360, Prevention of Cruelty Act, it actually tells me that it is illegal for a farmer to thirst or underfeed an animal. But do you really want to take a farmer to court for that, or do you want to educate them so that they understand why it is important for them to feed the animal properly with food that meets its physiological requirements and ensure that it is in a comfortable environment, because then productivity goes up and the farmer then is able to make better returns. I think with work we've done with the big poultry producer and the big pig producer, we have economic data that shows that if you manage your animals well, especially the environment, if you give it enough bedding, it won't end up with injuries, and that then gives you a better product that fetches better livelihoods for you in the market. So those are things that all of us, and that's why when I started, I said we, collectively, it's not a World Animal Protection thing, it is all of us that need to be ambassadors to ensure that animal welfare is catered for across the continent. It is not specific organizations or governments, but all of us have responsibility around that. As I conclude, the last question was about GMO. I think as an organization, at this point in time, I would like to, Tennyson is here, he can correct me if I'm wrong. As an organization, we are still grappling with GMOs, and we are still trying to develop a policy around that. So I would not want to cheat you that we have a policy that says one way or the other. Yeah, and so we are watching the debate. We know the pros and cons around it, and I think it's a debate that we need to have as Kenyans or as Africans and determine what works best for us, because some of these things, they are not ready answers. So for the GMO question, I'd like to beg not to answer because I don't have a position that I can state. Thank you. The online questions, so that I can finish.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Victor, for that. And about one of the question, last year we had the first Kenyan One Health Conference in partnership with ILRI, Afrohun, and other organizations in the country. So it's a discussion that is picking up, and we are really involving One Health experts. I have a couple of questions from online, but I'll start with the two comments. One is from Samson Keiru. Thank you, Samson Keiru, for your comment. I'll read as he has posted it. My name is Samson Keiru from Slow Food Kenya. Thank you so much for the great presentation. Mine is a comment. In USA, we have a good friend who started Meatless Monday movement or campaign that encourages people to reduce their meat consumption for their personal health and the health of our planet. This is also encompasses seeking plant-based proteins. Skipping a day or two in a week could be a way to reduce meat intake, which is good for our health and the planet as well. Another comment from Willis Mboya. Moving forward, there's need for adoption of new concept called policy prioritization through value chain analysis, that is PPVC, in formulating or reviewing existing policies that touch on food systems with focus on achieving our productive, equitable, resilient, sustainable food systems that are capable of providing food security and nutrition to all. Then I go to three questions. I'll start with one from Helen Shikanda. Thank you, Helen. What suggestions do you have for sustainable agricultural shifts that we can embrace without interfering with the culture that is ingrained in us? Then there's another one from anonymous attendee. What will reduction of animal protein mean in the fight against global warming? Then there's one from Mary Maleba. Does climate change in any way contribute to animal cruelty, considering the circumstances these animals are living in at the moment? Thank you, online participants, and I'll hand over to Yamu to respond to your questions. Thank you. Yes, does climate change in any way contribute to animal cruelty, considering the circumstances these animals are living in at the moment? Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll start with the middle one, the anonymous one. Reduction. What does reduction in meat consumption of protein consumption contribute to fight of global warming? I think in my presentation we already showed that production of that meat is already contributing to about 26 up to 30% of global green gases. Hence, reduced consumption should reduce production, which then would mean that we have less green gas, which then leads to the reduced global warming. Remember that in COP20, in the COP meetings, there's a target to reduce global warming by about 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that's part of what we need to look at. For predominantly, it's been looked at around from the fossil fuels and the fuels in our vehicles, but we are saying as an organization that the contribution coming from agriculture needs to be factored into that conversation. And that's something that we would like to see. My two journalist friends, Helen has asked for suggestions for sustainable agricultural shifts. What I would like to say is that from an organizational perspective, the first shift we want to see is improvement on the production system. What we are talking about, adoption of farmed animal responsible minimum standards. If you look at those standards, they talk about spacing, they talk about managing the production system, they talk about the rate at which the animal should grow, they talk about the light intensity in the production system. All these things are important because collectively then they contribute to the welfare of that animal. But beyond that, we are also saying there are agricultural production systems that have been practiced traditionally in Africa that we need to then look at critically because they would aid in leading to sustainable agricultural shifts that we are talking about. So it's about, one, looking at the welfare of the animal and adhering to farms so that we move to a high welfare production system. But beyond that, then looking at alternatives to factory farming or industrial production system that then are sensitive to to the environment. For Malemba, does climate change in any way contribute to animal cruelty? The answer to that is yes. If you've looked at what is happening out in northeastern or the drought situation, the animals are actually going through a lot of welfare issues. They're not getting enough food, they're not getting enough water, they're being forced to walk long distances, they don't even have a comfortable environment. And so it's one of those things that cuts both ways. Poor welfare is leading to climate change, but climate change is also impacting on the animals negatively. And I think that's something, because ultimately the animals are dying, and that is a welfare issue that needs to be addressed critically and urgently. Maybe my good friend, the researcher, Mwinde, wants to add one or two things. And I can see Mercy is also asking a question. So, okay.
Actually, I'm not asking a question. I want to affirm on an answer that you've given. As we seated here, it should be clear to us that we're not demonizing the consumption of proteins from the animal sources. That is one thing that should come out clear from us here. Because of the role that the animal protein play in our health. And we know the animal protein, they are the only source of protein that have all the 9 essential amino acids. But then when we're looking at it from the other side, we have an increased consumption of animal protein trends, as we will see tomorrow, and that is affecting us negatively, our health and our environment. So what we're trying to address from this sitting, it is that the excessive consumption of animal protein source. So that then leads to, if we reduce the consumption of the animal protein source, what are the other sources of it that we're looking at? So that pushes us to other sources, and apart from the plant protein sources, we have also other sources like insects. They're a very good source of protein. So those are some of the ways, those are some of the strategies that we will be exploring. But again, as we go exploring to those strategies, we will look at the acceptability of it. We are Africans, we have our foods, we have our ways of producing food. So we will also have to look at that aspect when we proposing this. How ready are we? How well is it syncing with our culture? We were the other day, we were looking at, there was a proposal to use worms to rehabilitate malnutrition. And we had a very heated debate in a nutrition forum respect our culture, respect our food, despite the fact that worms, research has been done and they've proven to be a very good source of protein. So those are some of the ways, again, we will have to articulate. Yeah.
There is one more.
Hello.
Yes, please.
I'm Patricia from Calro. Mine is a question. Today's discussion focuses on intensive production. And how about the extensive production system? Maybe you can comment on the level of antibiotic use and the welfare of the animals produced under the extensive system. Thank you.
Okay, I'm being told to respond briefly because the next presentation is actually looking at all that. We cannot pack everything into one. But the reality is that the small-scale farmers have the same challenges that the large-scale farmers. In fact, from a purely AMR perspective, I think we have a bigger problem in small-scale farmers because they can easily buy antibiotics. They don't have standards. That is something that we need to look at. But that's the reason why we brought you here. We want to hear your experiences as a researcher and what you think needs to happen. Yeah. We, as World Animal Protection, we are providing that platform for us to have this discussion. This is the inaugural one. Next year, I want a bigger one. But I want to hear African voices in this discussion around, are we eating much meat? Is it causing problems? Is the AMR an issue? I know I can quote a few research pieces that has been done. I know Patrick is also setting up one to actually talk to the farmers, because our feeling is when you do a survey, the farmer tends to give you the right answers that he thinks you need to get. So we want to have a bit of focus group discussion with dairy, pig, and poultry farmers in the coming month to just really get to the ground and see what they're doing around some of these things. But the reality, I don't think this, in my feeling and my estimation, I could be wrong, and that's why I'm saying it's my personal view. I think the corporates are slightly ahead of the small-scale farmers, and we need to bring the small-scale farmers to a better understanding on management of antimicrobials and biosecurity and all those things. And that's why I think there are big projects, some are funded by USAID, that are in this country that are looking at how to best work with small-scale farmers around welfare and productivity and responsible use of antibiotics. But it's a discussion that we are willing to have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. Can we give Dr. Amo a clap for the good job he has done? Yeah, thank you, Yamo. Now we are going to break for tea. We should take a short time, but before that, I'll request Tenson to give a comment, then we'll go for tea.
Thank you, Patrick. So again, I just wanted to leave you with some thought-provoking considerations around this whole subject. And let me be clear, as I said in my welcome remarks, this is not about anti-meat. It is very important that we clarify that. It is not about anti-meat. In any case, for those perhaps in this room, outside this room, who are pro-meat, to the extent that they hold a view that factory farming must be encouraged, etc., etc., please think for a moment. Think for a moment. One, the world population, including Africa's population, including Kenya's population, is bound to increase. For every additional individual that is born to this world will require food to eat. If that number is significant, whether at national level, regional level, or global level, it will mean, given the current trend, given our production systems, the requirement to produce a lot of food from animals to feed that population. In order to do that, it is very clear that we have to put huge chunks of land under cultivation, because it is crop production that supports animal production. As we continue to do that, we will tamper with the environment. The amount of rainfall that we are supposed to be having, we will have interfered with. And that is going to affect us. So the proposal that we are putting here is, let's consider other ways through which we can feed ourselves without necessarily causing us the kind of problems that we experience. Interestingly, the world climatic conditions are interconnected. As we speak right now, with the dry spell we experience in the eastern horn of Africa, in West Africa, the rains should be easing. But there are serious floods in Nigeria and other places right now where it is supposed to be getting dry. And whilst it is flooding in Nigeria heavily, Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea is not having rains. So you can imagine. And even that floods, they are losing crops because the flood waters, they settle for over weeks. They don't move, and crop that has been there already is destroyed. So this whole thing that we are talking about is really something we must have a deep reflection around. And it is about the quantity, the volume that we are consuming. Let us consider that at the heart of this conversation. We need to reduce that. We need to seek for alternatives. Let me close by saying, in the whole climate change debate, whilst Africa is seen as being on the receiving end because we are food insecure, it is also the same notion that we may not necessarily only have a response that is from an adaptation point of view. We must also look at Africa's contribution from a mitigation point of view, because we are also cutting down trees for charcoal in Africa. We cannot blame that on Europeans, because the Europeans are not the ones who come to Africa, cut down trees for cooking. We are the ones who cut down trees for cooking. Look at the situation we have in the north of this country. It is really, really mind-boggling. And we got to do something about it. So this debate is not a selfish debate. We are not proposing something that is about them, not about us, but it's about the good of the world. So please, I just wanted to make this point clear, because we have to continue to repeat ourselves as much as it will be necessary. Thank you for your attention. God bless.
Thank you so much, Tennyson. And I think now is a good time to take a short break. Let's make it very short. So we take our tea, we take 15 minutes to have our tea. It's served outside there. And also our online participants. Yes, it's unfortunate you are not able to share that cup of tea with us. And just to let you know, we'll be away for 15 minutes, so we'll be back at 11:15. Let's make it quick. Thank you. And to kickstart us now is Daniel. We'll talk about livestock production and climate change. But I understand some of us joined a bit late when we had all introduced ourselves, so I'll ask him to introduce himself, then he'll take over this presentation. Daniel. You have 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I'll try. 45. 30.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning once again. It's a privilege to stand before you, and I've been asked to introduce myself. I often forget this. So my name is Daniel Korir. I'm a Kenyan-trained veterinarian. I've also done some training in livestock production systems, and I'm currently completing my PhD on climate change and livestock production. And that's what I'll be diving deep into this morning, trying to answer the question, why livestock on the climate change discussion? as we'll see as we move forward, there's a very close tie, and it goes just beyond the tie between livestock production and climate change, but it also spills over to our habits, our feeding habits, and that's when, again, the conversation of climate change and food systems comes in. So I've been told I have 30 minutes, so without much ado, I'll just move straight into my presentation. And now I've broken down my presentation into the following sections. So I'll give an overview of the importance of livestock production systems in an African context. Then I'll tell us where these animals are found briefly. I'll tell us the projections going in the future, what does the animal look like. I'll talk about livestock production or livestock and greenhouse gas emissions. Then we'll wrap up this by seeing what these systems, or what we learn from all this that we would be discussing today. It looked like we are all African here. And we must have been brought up in an African setup somewhere, where there was some livestock in one form or another, whether cattle, whether sheep, whether poultry. But these are assets that are not new to all of us. And these assets play a critical role in the livelihood, actually, of our people. And this is important to bring it up front, so that as we go into the discussion, we don't look at livestock as an enterprise only, or a source of livelihood only, or just a business. But in an African context, it plays a role more than that. For example, for a young man in a Maasai community, he will not get married if the homestead don't have cattle. Is that not true? Most of us also, I think the main source of protein we got when we were growing up was drinking milk from our father's cattle, or eating eggs. Yes? So really, these are just not business assets. They are more than that in our communities. In an African context, ruminants are the most popular ones. We are talking of cattle here. We are talking of sheep. We are talking of goats. In our highlands, in our high potential areas, we will find such kind of practices. These are dairy animals, either kept in extensive system where they are grazed on paddock fields, or in the high densely populated areas where we have zero grazed animals, where a farmer goes harvest the fodder for the animals somewhere and bring it to a stall-fed animal. We are familiar also with this backyard poultry keeping. All this, remember I said, play more than just a financial source to the households. In the lowlands, in the dry areas where they receive probably little or less rainfall, we will have the extensive system, the pastoral kind of practice. All these sum up to this on one part, giving us food. Sale of this animal provide the household with fees to pay for their children. And we all love eating meat. I know there's an exception where we have the vegans and the vegetarians, but majority of people eat meat. And they eat meat because our nutritionists tell us it's an essential component of our diet. It provides us with some of the essential amino acids which plant sources don't. As we grow up, we go to school, we get jobs, we start earning money, we start eating meat, not just because it's nutritious, but because it's associated with a class. We want to meet over the weekends over beer and nyama choma. We want to eat meat probably because when we were growing up, we think we did not eat enough, and therefore, because you can afford now, you want to compensate the deficit that, that you incurred during your childhood. This is a graph showing us the trends of human populations between 1950 and projections to 2050. I want us to pay particular focus, especially to sub-Saharan Africa. Sorry. Yes. This line here. Compare this line with this one, and this one. It's evident that Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, is still in the face of what we are calling the lag phase, is still exponentially growing compared to other regions of the world where the human population growth has started stabilizing. It is projected that by 2050, the African continent will be having a population of about 2.1 billion people. 2.1 compared to what we have now, about 1.6. That's almost 50% increase in human population within a span of about 20 years. What does the livestock numbers look like? This is how livestock numbers look like globally. Again, from pre-industrial days, 1890s, to just some 10 years ago, we saw an exponential growth of animal numbers again between 1950 and the current situation. What's synonymous with this, with the 1950? That's the agrarian revolution. That's the time when we start having advancement. That's the time we start having major development in food production. And because of that food production, what happened? We start eating better. Eating better meant that we were more fertile. Being more fertile, it meant that we produce more children. And that what exactly explains what's happening in the human population. And because there are more people now who need to eat more food, that's why also the animal production, or the animal numbers, had that sharp increase between the 1950s and what we see now. Let's come back to Africa as a continent. These are the animals that we have. As I said, our main production system is focused around ruminant production. We have 35% of the world goat population. We have about 38% of the world sheep population. We have about 15% of world cattle population. And we have about only 4% of world pig population and about 7% of world chicken population. But these trends, especially for poultry, that's chicken and pigs, is rapidly changing. It's changing because our natural resources, that is land and water, is almost reaching its elastic limit for the rangeland productivity. That is to say, the numbers we have now is almost at the optimum level our systems can support. Now, let's go back to what I just said earlier, or what the graphs I showed you. We saw that the population is still rapidly growing, but the natural resources, that is land and water, is almost peaking. Then what will happen going in the future? Definitely there will be a mismatch between the human population and the animal numbers. let me take you back a little bit to African context. I've said production systems are mainly ruminants. Our ruminants are mainly produced in smallholder and medium holder systems. That is to say, our farmers keep few animals. We don't keep so many animals in our homestays. We just keep what our land or our land ownership can sustain. Exceptional cases is in the pastoral systems, where land is still communally being owned, and therefore, in such setup, they can still afford to keep large number of animals. But up to 60% of our livestock population are produced under smallholder system. Victor mentioned about the advantages and the challenges which smallholder farmers face, especially when it comes to antimicrobial use. I want to highlight also now in terms of animal production component, the advantage of these smallholder systems that we have. Most of our smallholder systems are integrated. And in many food forum systems you attend nowadays, you hear of this term circular food systems or integrated food systems. What does this mean? Or in some contexts, they call closed loop systems. So in a typical smallholder setup, we'll have a farmer keeping cows, sheep, or goat, or poultry. On the side, the farmer is cultivating some crops for subsistence use in the homestead. And also the farmer will be having either some cash crop, and on the side also having some pastures for the animal. In typical sense, this farmer would buy very little inputs for the use in the farm. Take this instance. On the photo I have, these animals are producing manure. The manure is being used in producing the crops here. The farmer is foregoing purchasing inorganic fertilizer, which we know has an effect on the health of the soil and also has an effect on the climate. Instead, the farmer is using this resource, which is having its own farm, to produce crop. Again, this crop is harvested. The leftovers or the stovers is fed to the animals. So really, there's no loss here. The crop is benefiting from the animals, and the animals are benefiting from the plants. Going back to my graph, it's projected that by 2050, Africa would need about 2 more times the amount of milk that we are consuming now. Why this high consumption at projection at 2050? Because we are expecting that most of the economies in Africa would develop between now and then. Secondly, we have seen that we're going to have about a 50 to 80% increase in the population. And thirdly, we are expecting that most of the populations will move from the rural areas to the urban setups. And that would mean probably more income to these people, and therefore they will have more disposable income to spend on these products. Also, we are projecting that there will be an increase also in the consumption of poultry and pork. And specifically poultry here because it's considered as a white meat. And what does nutritionists tell us? That white meat are more healthy. I'm not a human nutritionist, so I won't comment on that. But really, it's projected that not just because of the population growth and the increase in disposable income availability, but also as the population gets more affluent, the element of eating healthy start coming in. And therefore also, the shift in the eating habits will also inform those changes that we project going into the future. Yet, as I already mentioned, that we are foreseeing a mismatch between the population growth and the productivity and the increase in the number of animals. We also know that animals are a very inefficient way of producing food. I'll give you two examples. One, if you feed a cow 100 grams of nitrogen, of protein for this case, if you feed a cow 100 grams of protein, it will only give you back between 30 to 40% of that. Are we together? That is to say, if we produce soy or soya to feed to cows, in short, what we are saying, if we had taken that soya and feed human, we would have fed 100 people. But instead, by passing through livestock, we eventually end up feeding how many people? Only 30 people. Ruminants are known to be very inefficient when it comes to producing protein. Another thing I need to mention here is that the shift that we are likely to see also will be more on the production of poultry and pork, because these are considered more efficient compared to ruminants. So whereas ruminants are giving you 30 to 40, non-ruminants, that's poultry and pigs, can give you 50 to 60%. So from the production side point of view, people then, or farmers might then opt to keeping more poultry and pig rather than what? Rather than ruminants, because they are considered less efficient. Victor mentioned about this. How much meat and milk are we drinking as an African continent per person compared to the rest of the world? It's estimated, or nutritionists tell us, that we need to eat 300 to 500 grams of protein per week. That translates to about 20 to 30 kilograms of meat per year. But currently, how much meat are we eating as the developing world? Sorry. Should be somewhere around this range. That's to say, if the meat that we are eating as an African continent was equally distributed amongst the population, then we would just be eating just the right amount of meat that we are supposed to be eating. This may look like a good figure, but the challenge here is, again, the distribution is not well even out. Probably 70% of that meat is eaten by about 30 or 20% of the population who are in the urban centers or on the cities. So this number looks good, but it masks some things inside there. Look at what's happening in the developed world. Talk of Europe, talk of the Americas. They're eating almost or more than double what we are eating. That's to say, they are what? They are overeating. I'll come back to that point towards the end of my presentation. So, going into the future, as a continent, because of the population growth, it is seen that then, because the numbers might not allow us to meet the production needs that we'll need in future, then it is being seen that intensification might be the only way to feed the future population. So instead of this farmer keeping these 30, 40 birds in that space, we need to lump more poultry into the same space, causing the challenges which Victor was mentioning: overcrowding. If you are overcrowding animals, using the words of Victor, you are creating a container of superbugs, of diseases. And because of this unfriendly conditions for the animals become more sick. Or if there is an outbreak of a disease, a larger number of animals will be infected, and that would mean more antibiotics being used in the production. The animals also could be stressed in this context, and if the animals are stressed, what happens? The productivity comes down. So these are the hidden or masked challenges that would come associated with the shifting from the smallholder system that we know from our systems in an African context to these systems which we are calling intensification, but really, in real terms, we are converting what used to be part of our livelihood to becoming a commercial asset, and at the end of the day, it loses its sentinel value, or we drop the sentinel value of these animals. So with intensification, we will tend to select for animals that are more productive, and in this process, we drop our genetic heritage of our animals. Africa is known for the diversity of both plant and animals, but if we start moving towards intensifying our system, we'll tend to keep more frictions, we'll tend to keep more broilers, we tend to keep more layers, and lose our indigenous breeds of animals. That's the biodiversity loss I'm talking of here. If we are intensifying our animals, it means that we are going to feed more concentrates because we want these animals to grow very fast. And where is this concentrates going to come from? We'll have to clear our forest because we think that the forest is still more productive. So we'll clear our forest in the name of feeding human. We'll push these animals into smaller spaces. And in the process, we introduce machines to feed our animals. We introduce heating of this or air conditioning of these housing units to make the animals more comfortable because of what we are subjecting them into. And in the process, we are producing more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Because of the large production scale also, we'll have to source for inputs into these systems from very far, as far as Brazil. We are getting here in Kenya the soil that we are feeding our animals as far as Brazil, Argentina. And because we are producing a lot again, we'll have to export some of it maybe as far as Nigeria, West Africa. And what's that associated with? This long distance which we are transporting our products, first, make our systems high emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, and secondly, make our systems very highly unsustainable. Because, for example, war breaks out in Brazil or Argentina, just like what we are experiencing now in Ukraine. It means we will not have those inputs coming in. What will happen? Our food production system will collapse. So these are really the hidden things that when we move from smallholder systems to intensive systems, we might not see upfront, but in the long run will come hitting hard on us. So as I've said, with this, we'll have health concerns, which will lead to an increase in zoonotic diseases, that's spread of diseases from animals to humans or humans to animals. Increase of use of antibiotics. We'll also have manure challenges. Because of confining animals in small spaces, this will lead to heaping up of manure in large volumes in a small area. And when you concentrate manure in one area, three things happen. One, you'll have a lot of nutrient losses being washed into water bodies or being leached into water table underground. And that leads to deterioration of water quality. In very simple terms, the water will be deteriorated because you put in nutrients which was not supposed to be there in water, that's nitrogen and phosphorus, and what that leads to is that it leads to more growth of plant material in water bodies. And when there's that large growth of plant material in water bodies, it leads to what you call eutrophication. And eutrophication actually is bloom of plants in water bodies. And when those plants dies, what happens? is there's be large or huge consumption of oxygen, and that leads to death of animals which live in those water bodies. There'll also be increase in ammonia emissions. These emissions are associated with the respiratory diseases, both to animals and staff working in those housing conditions. There'll also be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. I've mentioned greenhouse gas emissions. This is what's driving what we call climate change. I know many forums we go, we hear of climate change, or we have interacted with climate change in many contexts. And it's unfortunate that this is a topic which is, I don't know if to say it's complicated or it's poorly understood. It's in between there. Yeah, so what's climate change? So that we move fast. Climate change is a long-term change in weather events, whether rainfall or temperature. And this is mainly associated with human-related activities. Some of the activities we do in our day-to-day endeavors, in our search for livelihood, lead to emission of these greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change. And the unfortunate bit about climate change is that it's a global problem. Emissions being emitted in the global north is affecting us in the global south, even if we are not the main emitters of those greenhouse gas emissions. That is where the genesis of what you hear people say climate injustice originate from. It's because the activities of another region is affecting another region, a different region. And the calamity in this is that the response or the resilience of a region is dependent in its ability to adapt to the climate change. Because of the financial situation in the global south, in an African context, because most of our countries are still developing, they don't have the financial muscles to address this climate change, they are again the worst culprit in this. So they're emitting the lowest greenhouse gas emission levels, but they are the worst hit because of what I've just mentioned. Between 1880 and 2019, this is how our atmosphere has behaved. One, we have seen an increase in global temperatures. So between 1990 and now, we have seen an increase of about 1.2 degrees Celsius. At the same time, we have seen an increase in carbon dioxide almost simultaneously to that graph. That is to say, the increase in atmospheric temperature that we're experiencing is directly associated with what? The increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. This is what's happening in northern Kenya at the moment. This is what we were hearing happening a few months in Europe. This is what's happening currently in Nigeria. These are what we call extreme weather events. And with climate change, we will tend to see more of these events happening every now and then. They become more frequent with time as the intensity of climate change continue to intensify. Maybe it used to be, we are not saying these events never used to happen. They used to happen, but they used to happen at a more spread time span. But now they are becoming more frequent, and that frequency is being driven by climate change. So in terms of regions, or in terms of sources of greenhouse gas emissions per region, globally, we're estimating in terms of the agricultural space that, in terms of agricultural emissions, that 44% come from our livestock, our ruminant production system. Those are the animals I was calling ruminants, which I said they are the most common kept in Africa. So globally, we are expecting that enteric methane is contributing to this proportion. Related to livestock also here is the emissions from manure. This is the managed manure, and this is the manure deposited in pastures. If you move to African context, you see this proportion increase here. Why? Because, as I said, we are keeping more ruminants in Africa compared to the rest of the world. So that's explained this increase here. Moving even more specifically to sub-Saharan Africa, this just tells you that increase in the proportion of the kind of animals that we keep in this region. That's where enteric methane comes from. It comes from the rumen of ruminants when they are digesting the feed that they have eaten. Most of the gases come through the mouth. So the animal digests the feed in the rumen, then it belches out. When it's belching, gas comes out. This gas consists of carbon dioxide and methane. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It has a global warming potential equivalent to 28 molecules of carbon dioxide. So the standard greenhouse gas here is carbon dioxide. So we are giving it a global warming potential of 1. Methane, which comes from our ruminant production systems, has an equivalent global warming potential of 28. We also have this other gas called nitrous oxide, which comes mainly from manure, and this also has a global warming potential of about 265. So really, that's to say, the greenhouse gases that are mainly coming from our food production systems are very potent greenhouse gases being emitted into our atmosphere. And that's why in COP 26, that's the Glasgow Conference of Parties, one of the resolutions which came out of that was to reduce methane production by 30%. And really, the drive for that is because of this high potency of methane, and also because of the fact that as you reduce the amount of methane in the atmosphere, it has what you call a cooling effect. Because it's a short-term gas in the atmosphere, it stays only in the atmosphere for about 10 years. As you remove it, in the long run, it has an effect of, like, you are having a multiplier effect in the atmosphere, because if you have reduced it now, and it has a short time, it means then over time, we are going to have an exponential decrease in the amount of enteric methane in the atmosphere. So, this is what describes the emissions from our African continent. That our emissions are low compared to the rest of the world. And this is because, specifically here now I'm talking of the emissions from the livestock sector. And this is because the animals that we keep are smaller. And the size of the animal influences the amount of emissions that we get. So the smaller the animal, the less the emissions. The bigger the animal, the more the emissions. That's to say, the animals in the global north emit more than what our animals emit here. Again, we are feeding low concentrates to our animals. The concentrates here comes in the aspect that for you to produce the concentrates, you'll have to clear land. For you to produce the concentrate, you'll have to use some fertilizer. And that adds on to the emission that is associated with livestock production. So that's why the low use of concentrates here in our continent also reduces the amount of emissions that's associated with livestock production. And again, the manure that our animal produce have, because they are not so rich in nutrients, the diets that we feed the animals are not so rich in nutrients, it means that the manure that this animal produce are low in nutrients. And if they are low in nutrients, also that's associated with low greenhouse gas emissions. This is just an example of global representation of consumption of grains or different animal feeds across the world. If you look specifically here, this is sub-Saharan Africa. You can see, compared to Eastern Europe and it should be Southeast Asia, that's the China and the company. So if you compare the amount of concentrates that we are feeding our animals in sub-Saharan Africa compared to these developed parts of the world, it's very, very small. But when it comes to feeding grasses to our animals, you see it's the main diet that we feed our animals. So this just gives you an indication of emissions that is associated with the animals that we give to our animals. So you're saying here, despite now the African continent being the home of about only 15% of the cattle globally, is producing about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. And bring in also the aspect of productivity there. I just wanted to show you the mismatch between the productivity of the animals that we have in the region again compared to the global averages. So if this was universally equal, you would expect that because we have 15% of the cattle in Africa, then we should be producing 15% of the milk. But we are only producing how much? Only 3%. What that tells us is that our animals also are less productive. And that links to, again, the two things that I've said. One, they are of a smaller body size. Secondly, we are feeding them less concentrates or poorer diet. This is emissions. So per region, you'd expect that most of the emissions will be coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the Brazil. This is the Argentina. These are the renowned world producers of what? Meat and soy. The Amazon forest has been cleared about 60% to support the production of these enterprises. That's why you see the main source here is beef. In fact, this region have surpassed the North America and the Europe in terms of the emissions that they are producing, because they have really gone intensive in terms of livestock production. They have really gone intensive in terms of concentrates, not just for their productions, but they are supplying the rest of the world. Like most of the soy consumed by animals in this region and these other regions is coming from here. That's what's causing this big mismatch here. See where Africa is, sub-Saharan Africa is? You'd estimate that at less than 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, as I've said, Africa is the continent that is facing the worst consequences of climate change. You have read that question? This is what it will mean for us to shift then from our traditional production system, which I said they are more animal friendly, they are more circular. It will mean that we need to feed more concentrates to our animals, and that would mean we need to convert more land, more of our normally called protected land, and this protected land normally serves as stores for carbon, and carbon is the main source of greenhouse gas emission. So if we are converting more land into arable land, it means we are destroying carbon stocks or in short, we are releasing the carbon which is stored in those soils, in the plants, into the atmosphere, and we are contributing to climate change. It will also mean that we are using more fertilizer in our production system. And really, increase of fertilizer will not only lead to increase in greenhouse gas emissions, but as I said, it also harm our soil. It will also mean that we are increasing the nutrient use efficiency, both at plant and animal level, because the more nutrient you give to a plant or to an animal, the less efficient they become. That's to say, if you want the system to be more efficient in utilizing nitrogen, then you need to strike a balance between utilization and supply. It will also mean that we have more manure concentrated in small areas, and I've explained the consequences of that. It will also mean that we increase the animals that we keep, and increase in animals that we keep also lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So, in conclusion, what's the way forward? How can we salvage ourselves? I will submit to us that, one, we need to foster a more closed food system. And a typical good example of a closed system, of a circular system, is the traditional smallholder setup that we have in the African continent, where a farmer is keeping animals, the animal produces manure, that manure is used for producing crop, the crop residues that is produced from the farm is being fed back to the animals, and the cycle and the loop is closed. That is what will contribute to circular food systems which are environment or which are climate friendly. Secondly, we need to be more holistic in the approach we use in our production systems. So we don't just, as a farmer, look or focus on improving the productivity of the animal in terms of feeding it better, in terms of getting better genetics for the animals, but also look at what's the impact of the animal welfare, what is the impact of the well-being of the animal on the productivity of the animal as well. Look at what's the importance or what's the impact of the environmental health. And when I talk of environmental health here, I'm talking of the soil, I'm talking of the plants. What is the impact of the plant, what's the impact of the soil on the productivity of the animal? Because if the soil is not healthy, if you are killing all the microbials in the soil by pumping a lot of microbes, antimicrobials on the animals, it means the soil will not be productive. So the grass will not grow well on that soil. What will be the impact on that on the animal productivity? We also need to think of the product that you get from the animal. What is the impact of that on the health of the human, of you as a farmer, of you as a veterinarian? I've put a question mark on this. We need to check also our eating habits. And I'm putting a question mark here because is it my dress my choice? So is it my food my choice? This is a debate we need to have. We are all concerned about our health. So should then the argument be my food, my health, my food, my planet? We need to engage on that conversation. Say that as we become more affluent, as we get more income, as we progress as developing countries, that we don't move to the direction where the global north are, where they are eating 3 times more than what they are supposed to be eating, but we just cap on what we are supposed to be eating. Because that will not just have an impact on the climate. You've heard of the tragedy of the commons. Who is the custodian of the climate? Because it's all of us, then it's then to suffer from the tragedy of no one taking care of it. But if you take care of your health, which is a personal choice, then you also take care of our planet. We also need to address climate injustices. And I'll be very specific on one component here, that, as I say, that the African continent is suffering most from the impacts of climate change. And the smallholder farmer in this context is facing a lot of challenges which, if not supported, will be wiped out of the market, will be pushed out of the market. So really, as the conversations in the Conference of Parties, in the COP28 that's coming, we are talking of the Climate Fund, we are talking about Adaptation Fund. How are we helping the farmer to adapt to climate change? How are we adapting our smallholder systems as our integral food systems into surviving the impacts of climate change? So really, these global funds that are targeted towards climate change, there also need to be a conversation of how that can be channeled to make our smallholder systems more sustainable. And finally, there are opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that we produce from our systems. It's not cast on stone that this is the amount that a cow can produce. We can be able to bring down those emissions by things like feeding our animals better, providing our animals with better feed. And when I say better feeding here, I don't mean concentrates. Yes, you can provide some proportion of concentrates, but the big component here is a cow is meant to be eating grass, and that's what nature designed it to be. So if we provide these animals with better grasses, if we provide these animals with grasses harvested at the right stage, this will eventually reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the components in climate science, we refer to as mitigation options. I want to stop there and beg for any questions, if any.
Okay, another clap for Daniel. I think he has done justice to simplify all that science using that language, which really connects with us, is something not easy, and I think he has done that well. Thank you, Daniel, for simplifying that. Yes, now it's time for questions. I believe we have some. Yeah, so we'll have questions for the next 15 minutes. Then we proceed to our last presentation. I don't know who is helping me with passing the mic. Yes, there's one here. So again, you see your name, so that when it's respond to your questions, you can refer to you specifically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koril, for your awesome presentation. I have one comment and two questions. That was a very detailed view of how livestock production, on this side it's helping us, but then there's a consequence. And then now on the questions, the first question, are we talking about producing animal feed in large numbers to be able to feed the millions of animals you projected here? And when we are thinking of it, you have mentioned about deforestation, so that then people are able to produce enough feed for the animals. Coming into Kenyan context, I don't know how much deforestation we have done, so that then we are able to produce feed for the animals. And then, where at it, what opportunities do the ASA regions, which account for approximately 75% of the total Kenyan land mass, to be able to be used to grow animal feed, which then we can use for feeding these animals? And then the next question would be, when you're doing the calculations on the potential of for the global warming potential, for the manures that then people would use to be able to maybe ferment and do composting. Has that been shown to reduce the effects of or the emissions that are being emitted into the environment contributed to global warming? And of course, finally, you mentioned about exploring greenhouse emissions options, what you're calling about better feeding. When we resort to feeding animals with grass, of course, because that is what they were supposed to be eating, what is the effect on productivity, assuming everything else is constant? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kangeda, for those questions. I hope, Dr. you have noted them down. Any other? Yes, down there.
My name is Wangari Njoroge, and I'm with Lookup TV. You've mentioned about the conference of parties that is slated for early next month. But again, there are declarations that were made in the COP26 about adopting renewable energy by 2030, and also the mobilization of ecosystem, of ecological assets, yeah? Maybe you can give us the general outlook. How far are we with, we know that there is drought. How far are we with mitigating the drought with implementation of the process, implementation process of these reforms that were given at the COP26 declaration meeting?
Thank you for that. Any other before I check if you have any questions in our online platform? Yes?
Dennis from Farming Systems Kenya. My question would be specifically, what should the organizations or the governments in Africa do? Your suggestion is we continue with our smallholder, whereas the other countries who are doing an injustice to climate change are increasing their intensive. Why can't we all do intensive so that we can have an agreement somewhere? Or why then can we all do then smallholder in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. for that question. And if anyone from here? Okay, so Daniel will respond to that as we wait to see if online participants have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those who have asked those mind-bubbling questions. I'll try answer them. But I'm sure the conversation will go beyond this room because I don't have all the answers for you. Dr. Kangede asked, to what extent have we cleared forests in our country to feed livestock? Really, in our continent, we have not, or most of the deforestation that has occurred in our country are not directly to feed livestock, but generally to feed human. You've heard of encroachment of the Mao forest, another forest in Africa, the Congo forest. Really, in our context here, it's mainly the expansion or the growth of human population which is pushing for this clearance of forest. And I think the governments have not done justice in protecting this land well enough. But indirectly also you can see that these human beings go in there, and part of the activities that they do there is livestock production. So you cannot really rule out that we have been clearing land to produce livestock. But because people have been clearing land to settle there, and part, or actually their main livelihood in most cases would be livestock production, then you can really directly link that forest clearance to crop production. But I'll give you a hope here that it's not necessarily the clearing of forest which is harmful to the climate. It is the removing of the carbon either on trees or in the soil, that is harmful. The biggest concern here we have is carbon dioxide and methane. These two gases are made up of carbon. If you cut trees and burn them trees, in essence, what you are doing is you're converting a tree into carbon dioxide. If you cut a tree and the roots down there rot and microbes produce carbon dioxide, eat it and produce carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide eventually end up in the atmosphere. So is that release which is not good? If you cut trees and plant grasses, you have heard of climate smart grasses, you have heard of bracharia. These are grasses which deposit a lot of root material under the soil. And in that way, that's also seen as a carbon storage. Carbon sinks into the soil. So it's not just the cutting of trees which is harmful, it's the release of carbon from those trees which is not good for the environment. What are we doing in terms of our assals to produce more feed? Again, from an ecological point of view, what we need to understand about the arid and semi-arid ecosystems, these are very fragile ecosystems. And if you push them to the limit, that is to say, if you overstock them with livestock, or if you do excessive farming there, you are, in the long run or in a short while, going to make that ecosystem totally unproductive, whatever interventions you do again. So the best thing in the assals and semi-arids, that's the assals, is to try to maintain a homogeneous or a stable ecosystem. Stable ecosystem in this case is to just keep the animals that environment can maintain. Some of the simple interventions that you can do there is to do things like, there are things we call leguminous trees. These leguminous trees can feed your animals. At the same time, it helps stabilize the soil, because in most assals, the soils are very loose, so if you plant trees there, they'll hold the soil together and become more stable. So such intervention will not only stabilize the environment, but also increase the feed for the animals. There are also more drought-resistant grasses that have been bred over time. If you introduce those grasses in those environments again, they become more productive and therefore can support more animals. Yeah. Yes, you are right that the main problem here in these places is mainly water. But even besides drilling boreholes, these areas receives at least 400, 600 millimeters of rainfall annually. If you're able to harvest that water, because most of it actually is normally washed off, and that wash off actually is even another source of problem to those ecosystems. So if we're able to harness the resources that we have already, build dams, build shallow wells, it can really support a long way in improving the productivity of these ecosystems. But the major point that you need to understand here is that these are very fragile ecosystems, and when you're dealing with them, you have to be very, very careful. Yeah. The other point you ask is about the fermentation of manure. I guess you are referring here mainly to biogas or something like that. Okay. Manure produce greenhouse gases through fermentation process. So it's that same fermentation that's happening in the rumen. Some of the bacteria is passed out in the excreta into the environment, and the fermentation continues there. That's why it continues to produce greenhouse gases. Now, if you collect this manure and compost it, that means in the long run, you're extending the fermentation process. because once the manure leaves the rumen, in most cases it becomes, the environment outside is not conducive for production of, for those fermentation process, so there's no much methane that's produced. But if you ferment it, you increase the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm talking specifically here in the context of a biogas. Now, the issue here with biogas production is that even though it's extending the fermentation process, it is being seen as a green project, as a climate smart project, because you are collecting that methane that is being produced. You're not just producing it, but you're collecting it and using it for cooking, which instead you would have used either charcoal, or you'd have cut trees to use it for production of, for cooking, or you are using instead of the gases that is produced from the biofuels. Yeah? So that's the only component where that becomes a climate smart component. On the other hand, when it comes to composting, yes, you still produce these greenhouse gases, but during the composting process, you break also the nutrients and make it more available for plants. So it is that greenhouse gas is the foregone cost for improving the quality of the manure. So it's a kind of trade-off here. Yeah, it doesn't make it very clean, but it's a trade-off. So you weigh which has more advantage than the other. You ask also about the productivity of animals fed on grass. So, especially in our context in Africa, again, most of our grasses, we leave it to stay in the field to overgrow until it's not good again anymore for animals to consume. And that makes the production of animals come as low. I think the average production for a cow in Africa is about 2 to 3 liters. Whereas the same grass, if well managed and fed the animals at the right stage, that grass can give you 10 to 12 liters of milk from our animals. The point I'm driving here, the problem is not the grass. The problem is the management of the grass. So the grass still can give you good production level for our animals. 10 to 12 liters of milk is a good level of production. It's good, why? Because that's a reasonable amount to sell for a farmer. Secondly, it doesn't push an animal to production limit where the animal will start suffering at the expense of producing the milk. I hope that answers your question. Wangari asked about the general outlook in terms of implementation of the declarations from COP26. I don't want to talk on behalf of African group of negotiators here or government representative here, but from a science point of view, and what we expect to be happening is that we still see very low usage of the technologies that were intended to be promoted. Secondly, we see in what we call NDCs, nationally determined contribution, that the countries are not really committing to what they verbally committed in the conferences to be doing. So in short, what I'm saying is that the outlook is not good. We are not doing enough. And I think the general message which was coming out of COP26 is that we are not doing enough to avert the climate crisis. With the interventions that we are putting in place as of now, we are still going to exceed the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 if we continue with what we are doing. So really, there's nothing exciting about what we have done so far That's to say we need to raise our bar a little bit high in terms of the interventions that we are putting in place to meet our climate obligations. Dennis asked, what should African organizations be doing as far as climate change is concerned? And why are people in the global not continue to do livestock intensification while we are restraining ourselves here? I think I'll adopt the answer Victor gave earlier, that two wrongs will not make a right. We know that livestock intensification eventually would lead to increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, we know that livestock intensification in the long run, as we continue to feel the effects of climate change, will become unsustainable. And therefore, it will likely have a bigger disruption in terms of the food systems if we were fully reliant on intensive farms. So the call that the African organization should be doing actually is pushing for the continued survival, continued resilience, continue to build the resilience of African smallholder farms, because these have been proven to be sustainable. Secondly, these production systems support just beyond the food and income for these farmers, but it's also the identity. So if you kill this sector, you're killing the identity of the African people. I hope I answered all the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Daniel, for that presentation and responding to questions. If you want further clarification, you can catch up with him during lunch break. From the online participants, I have one comment from Willis Mboya, and I'll read it. Intensive farming contributes to high greenhouse gas emissions. Emission reductions from food production have so far received less attention in greenhouse gas mitigation policies than those from energy, transport, and other industrial sectors. Consequently, emissions from agriculture could become the dominant source of global emissions and the next pandemic by mid-century. Just trying to emphasize the connection between greenhouse gas emissions, intensive livestock farming, and the risk of going that route, the risk of saying, my food, my choice. Yes, I'll welcome Tennyson. I see he has a comment to make before Victor comes to make a short presentation.
Thank you, Patrick. Actually, I'm interested in the point that was raised by our friend from Farming Systems, Kenya. I don't know whether, Daniel, you responded to that. But it is exactly the reason why we are asking for Africa to take advantage of where we are now. You know, if you look at the systems in China, the US, my brother, that's not where we want to go. We may not be food self-sufficient. Whilst that is an issue, we need to have enough food. The food we need to have does not necessarily have to be such that we are completely not taking into account in the first place what we are doing to the animals that go through such systems. The cruelty, the suffering is on a massive scale. On the other hand, the amount of land you need to cultivate to be able to sustain those production systems, and as you have heard from Dr. Daniel, the emissions that come from the plants, etc., is part of the problem that we are facing. So Africa is at a vantage point in some ways. The fact that our system is not as industrialized doesn't necessarily have to be seen as why we are backward. We have to take advantage and therefore promote, like he said, our smallholder systems, which are closed to the extent that we can be food self-sufficient. I think it's that balance that we are asking for. You know, if you look at those systems in the US, if you look at those systems in China, tears will run your eyes if you are really, really concerned about the animals. But as I said again, the implications for climate crisis is what we are also suggesting here. And that's why in our strategy, we have these two intervention areas in our food system strategy that cross over. The no future for factory farming is one of those that we are proposing. That factory farming should not have a future in Africa. We want to disrupt those who are already highly industrialized, disrupt their systems so that they don't continue. Whereas in Africa, let's not even go there. You get? So that is what we are saying. And therefore, our second intervention is saying food revolution. That food revolution is now what we are talking about, this whole alternate protein sources. It cannot only be meat. Are we together? So this is basically what we are asking. So thanks for such a priceless presentation, my friend. I thought that was brilliant. I think this will have cost $1,000, by the way, but it's free. God bless you.
Okay, thank you, Chancellor, for chipping in to clarify that. It's well received. Yes, I'll request Yamo to make short presentation following a question that was asked, connection between climate change and animal cruelty, because we believe it's something worth discussing further. So I'll ask Yamo to come and strictly take. Okay, yes, he's still trying to sort out that. I guess we are getting the point that we are trying to drive here, which is really supported by data that is available at the moment. We understand there's much to look into, but again, this forms basis on the need to have a common ask as Africans. Because the moment it comes from us, the moment we are all collectively involved in making these kind of statements, the moment our voices will be heard. Of course, there's a big effort globally to protect some of the indigenous practices, to protect culture and all those kind of things, because not everything that is modern in quotes is good for us. We have to come up with the idea on how to see what is good, what is bad, what can be changed in a way to be good to us. So that is the kind of conversation, not just taking because it's from developed nations, this is good. I can use the example of battery cage production systems. You know, those are the kind of systems that have been banned in Europe. But because those guys invested a lot of money into that, they have nowhere to take them. And for that, they come to Africa. Africa, we know, is a liberal continent. We lack good policies, we lack regulations, we don't implement the little that we have, so they see Africa as a dumping site. So they come and tell you, hey, take this, it's efficient, and you'll see how it will be easy for you to manage your poultry production system. You'll take it because you are aware it has been used outside there. But again, no, it is here because those guys have nowhere to take it. And if you look into the future, corporates, if you look at retailing sectors, they are already putting up measures and policies and setting standards. By this year, I will not be buying products or rather eggs from caged production systems. So if you have these battery cage production systems here, where will you sell those eggs? Because the market is already changing. So it's that time we try to see what does the future look like. Whatever that we are trying to implement here, does it have a future? And if it has, what kind of future does it have? So I think those are the kind of things that are worth considering, and those are the kind of things that I hope we'll be able to discuss after lunch. As I mentioned, in the afternoon, we'll be having group discussions, just more group discussions, just to reflect on all what has been presented here today and what we will have discussed this morning, and to try to see what kind of opportunities are there, what kind of challenges are there, where does Africa sit behind all those presentations. Yes, Dr. Amo, I hope now everything is ready. Okay, okay. Yeah, so this is one of the projects that we did, it's one of the research that we did, because we are trying to look where does animal production or cruelty to animals sit when you talk about climate change. Dr. talked about feed production in Brazil, in Latin America. He talked about how that value chain is connected, how soya is being transported from Brazil to Europe, and again, I believe to some segments in Africa. We have seen what is happening to Amazon. We have Congo forest here. We have China coming to Africa. Where does all these events put in us as Africans? So that's when we conducted this study, Climate Change and Cruelty. The report was launched, I think, last month. There's a copy which will be shared for people to familiarize in depth with it. But shortly, I'd like Yamo to briefly take us through it. So over to you, Dr. And again, 15 minutes.
I feel pressurized, but I will survive. I'll quickly rush through climate change and cruelty, revealing the true impact of factory farming. As Mwinde said, it's a report that was done. The beauty is that I can skip all this because you've heard and come here. Even factory farms have done, I'll start here. So what we're saying essentially from the research that was done across four countries is that, and some of these things you saw in the morning in my presentation, we talked about the number of animals. Current production in 2018 is 80 billion animals consumed, 69 billion chickens, 1.5 billion pigs, and that's why those are the two we concentrate on, but we want to work on all animals. By 2030, we are saying that the growth will be about 30% in Africa, 18% in Asia and Pacific, and you can see the rest there. So the biggest growth in consumption of meat is actually going to happen on the continent. And the projected meat production growth, again, from the earlier slides, 5.9% for beef, 13% for pigs, 17% for chickens, and about 15% for sheep by the year 2030. So those are things that's partly discussed in the morning. And what are some of the impacts? Again, just a summary from the morning. We have impacts effects on public health, and we've talked about AMR and food-borne diseases. Then there's biodiversity loss and pollution because of the fact that we are clearing forests to grow animal feeds, and that leads to biodiversity loss, but we also then contaminating the environment using manure, which might come with the contamination, either antimicrobial resistant organisms or chemicals, etc., etc. And then we also have suffering of animals because of the production system not being high welfare. So we have animals packed in very close spaces that then lead to suffering. Sometimes the feeding of the animals is a challenge, and then because of the closeness, we end up with disease and disease outbreaks. And then, of course, it undermines food security because then the animals are not performing optimally. And we are ending up with a situation where that process is not reaching where it's supposed to be. But of interest is what is at the center. It drives climate change, and that's what we want to look at in this short presentation. Again, in the morning, we talked about the two goals. Goal one is around farmed animals living a life worth living or ensuring they have a good life. And goal two is about reducing or ensuring there's no commodification of wildlife. The two of them meet around animal feeds, because we're using wildlife habitats to produce feeds, and that's where the two of them then meet, and that interchange that we look at. In the morning, you also saw this, the fact that 26% of greenhouse gases is actually coming from factory farms, and the various levels at which it's coming from. But now I think what we wanted to do here is to maybe move into slightly into more details. And part of what Muinde is talking about when he did the carbon life cycle research, one of the things that came out is the amount of quantities that is coming from each specific animal. You can see cattle contribute about 5,000 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. We can see the pigs is about 819, chickens about 790. So the moral of the story is that each of those animals is contributing a certain amount. The question then is, what are we doing as Africa? Because we cannot also say that Africa is not contributing. There are certain levels of contribution that we need to look at, but we also need to look at intensive farming systems even more critically. Then, in terms of exactly what happens and where does the greenhouse gases come from, when you look at animals, and specifically here we are using cattle, you can see that manure contributes about 10% of greenhouse gases, just managing that manure when it's spread on the environment. The biggest contribution is actually coming from enteric fermentation, and that means when the animal is then chewing cud and fermentation is going on. Remember that cattle is a ruminant, so it has 4 stomachs. There's a process around fermentation that occurs that leads to production of methane. 44% of that, greenhouse gases is actually coming from that enteric fermentation. And then the next big thing is coming from the feeds that we are providing them. And I think, I'm not sure whether Korir showed, but there's aspects that is actually coming from that because of whether you use grain and what kind of grain you're using, then it will contribute to that. Then of course, 5% is coming from the energy. When you're doing distribution, you're using vehicles. That is part of what we need to be factored in. So in a nutshell, that's where the greenhouse gases is coming from in the production system. And that then is what is driving climate change that we then need to try and address. But then the report that Muinde is talking about, climate change and cruelty, which was launched, I think, about a month ago. Some of the aspects that are critical is the fact that the research was done is comparison of environmental impact of conventional factory farming and impact of industrial farms with higher welfare standards. So we are comparing what we are talking about, what the organization is recommending, that we move to higher welfare production systems that then adhere to farm animals responsible minimum standards. So we are comparing the conventional production system and one which is adhering to farms. Yeah? We then measured the impact of human diets containing less chicken and pork and combined the two scenarios to model the climate change and environmental impact when people eat less and eat better. Yeah? Less means you're consuming less meat, but you're eating better quality meat because it's coming from a high welfare production system. And then did projections to climate change impacts into 2030, 2040, and 2050. We used the big 4 factory farming giants, that is China, Brazil, US, and the Netherlands representing Europe. And essentially then we looked at the animal feed, side of it, and we also looked at the farm animal side of it. In terms of the farm animals, we looked at feed market mix, harvested animals, animal rations, and animal husbandry techniques, and conversion of emission from digestion, while from the feed, we looked at the impact of crop cultivation, transportation, crop processing, processed product, and crop for export, and then we combined the two of them to then determine the carbon life cycle figures that we are looking at. And so essentially the findings show that as per capital consumption per person per year, we already know that you can see the figures there. Pigs in the Netherlands is about 33 kilos per person per year, and you can see the spread 33, 32, 12, 26, 24 across the 4 countries, with the Netherlands being the highest consumer of pigs, while chicken, the US was the highest consumer at 50%. Across the 4 countries, annual chicken consumption creates the same climate change impact as keeping 29 million cars on the road for a year. So essentially what we did was to convert that consumption into what is already known. And as we said earlier in the morning, a lot of work is done around fossil fuel. And so it's just trying to convert what is unknown, in this case, consumption of that product, into what is equivalent or known. And so we are just saying that if you're going to consume at that level, across the 4 countries, then the impact is equivalent to 29 million cars on the road for a year. Yeah. Then we looked at percentage methane from pig manure, and in the Netherlands it's 21%, Brazil 24%, US 22%. So essentially we're saying that methane is a greenhouse gas with the potential for warming of our climate, and 113 governments have signed a pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, and you can see the impact at that level. Yeah. The other finding was the biggest climate change and environmental impact of factory farming is actually caused by production from crops for animal feeds. And you remember the slide that I showed, 41% of it is actually coming from that feed. Then deforestation also causes carbon to be released into the atmosphere when trees are cut down. So when that process of cutting trees and clearing forests is actually also contributing to that process because carbon then is released into the atmosphere. And then we then try to estimate how many trees would it be equivalent to consuming a certain amount of meat. And so 10 kilograms of chicken is equivalent to 4 trees being cut, and 10 kilograms of pork is equivalent to 5 trees being cut. And then you can then factor that in your calculation in terms of deforestation and carbon being released into the atmosphere. Yeah. Production of feed crops utilizes large quantities of water, so the other level is the water scarcity thing that we need to be looking at. By just doing production of feed crops, you're using a lot of water, which is also not sustainable. And production of feed crops also pollutes water bodies that animals and people rely on in terms of use of fertilizers and pesticides. So those things end up in water bodies, and that's also becoming critical. So as we come to conclusion, using land to grow crops to feed animals that will become food is highly inefficient, because out of 100 calories, and I think my friend will be talking about a nutritional view, you use for every 100 calories that you feed to farm animals, you're only getting about 17 to 30 calories of food nutrients that reach humanity. So maybe it's easier to just feed the 100 calories of crop directly to humanity. It might be slightly more efficient than what we are seeing now. And meat and dairy provide only 18% of overall calories and 37% of proteins for human, but use almost 83% of farmland. So you are having a big farm space, but you're only using with 83% of the farm space, but you're only getting 18% of calories and 37% of proteins. There must be a more and better efficient way to get proteins, and that's what we are saying as an organization. Yeah? So we then looked at percentage decrease in climate change impact for reducing meat consumption per person per year by 50% by 2040, and you can see the numbers. You'll have 54% decrease in climate change in the Netherlands from pigs if you just reduce consumption by 50% by the year 2040. And the figures are there for you to see the other numbers, just to save time. So the findings is, we are saying that together we can take the equivalent of 45 million cars off the road by just eating 50% less and ensuring that we do that by 2040. And that's what I think my colleague and friend from Slow Food was talking about. That's what's driving things around a no-meat day in our diets, and something that we need to be looking at, because those figures then contribute significantly into reducing the carbon climate change for that matter. And so what can we do? We are saying that consumers should choose to eat less but better. And again, I want to emphasize that we are not saying we stop eating meat. We're just saying eat less meat, but eat better quality meat from high welfare production system. We're also saying join our call to government, stop approving factory farms, and they are being driven within national climate actions, also known as nationally determined NDCs. So one of the challenges I think we want to pose to the participants is, can we find out what our NDC says? Because they're already there. The Kenyan one was done in 2017. What is it committing us to do, and how do we drive that process to ensure that we achieve the reductions that we are trying to achieve from our production systems? We're also saying you need to support the industry, and so industry needs to implement farm animal responsible minimum standards, farms as a minimum. And again, what you're seeing there, farms initiative, is actually, you can Google farms initiative and it will give you all the details around farms, because it will tell you the stocking density, where if it's chickens or pigs, it will tell you about light intensity, it will tell you about all the other aspects that we need to look at. We also need to end deforestation in animal feed sourcing and start looking at a better way to feed our animals. We need to halve production of animal proteins by 2040 and phase out sourcing of monocrops. And essentially monocrops like soya is when you only grow one crop in a big acreage. That is not sustainable, and the drive is to do that by 2030. Yeah? And essentially that's, in a nutshell, to try and meet Mwinde's 15 minutes. I have been forced to rush through it, but we are available in the afternoon for further discussions around the research piece. The report is also available for those who are interested. We can give it to you or send you a copy, and you can help us drive the process of ensuring that we have a more sensitive production system that then caters for the animal, but also ensures that it's sustainable and will ensure that we have a better production. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I always call him my senior because he happens to have graduated a few years before me. So I just want to apologize for rushing him here in front of you so that I don't get hammered later. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. for taking us through climate change and cruelty report. And again, this report is publicly available in our website. You can search for it and you'll get it. I'll only take 3 questions or comments, if any, so that we break for lunch. If there's none, the better. But any comments, questions? Only 3? I'm just conscious of the time. But that does not mean you keep quiet, so please. Ian, anyone online? Okay, yeah. Meanwhile, just to emphasize on this impact, Amazon, I think Daniel talked about it, Victor talked about it. It happens to us that one of our colleagues did a visit there recently, and he reported a devastating situation down there. There's a short clip which I hope we'll be able to get hold of it, and we'll play it when we get back here. Now we break for, okay, yeah. To our online participants, thank you so much for staying put, for staying with us up to this point. We appreciate your active participation and many questions and comments that you put across. You'll get communication from us from the next step that you are taking, especially about the joint statement that we mentioned that we'll be working on. It will be shared with you tomorrow so that at least you can also have your input. But again, thank you so much for staying with us up to this hour. Yeah, so from this point, I hope everyone got a mail card. That is what we'll use to get our lunch. It's ready now, and you just use the lift. It's on 3rd floor. Then we'll be back here 10 minutes to 2, at least 10 minutes to 2, so that we can plan for the remaining section of work that we have. So thank you again, and enjoy your lunch.